Tzitzit are an important biblical commandment and symbol in Jewish tradition, originating from God's command in the Torah. They serve as a physical reminder of God's laws and a call to holiness. Their significance is deeply tied to Jesus' teachings and their application in everyday life. The commandment to wear tzitzit appears in Numbers 15:37-41, where God instructs the Israelites. Speak to the children of Israel and tell them to make tassels, tzitzit, on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue, techelet, on each tassel. And you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you go astray. A similar command is found in Deuteronomy 22 verse 12, which says, "You shall make yourself tassels on the four corners of the garment with which you cover yourself." God commanded the wearing of tzitzit as a constant reminder of His commandments. The tzitzit symbolize obedience, faithfulness, and separation from sin. The presence of the blue thread, techelet, is significant because blue is associated with the heavens and God's throne, reminding wearers of their divine connection. The blue dye, techelet, has long been debated. Traditionally, Jewish sources claim it was derived from a sea creature called the kilazon, often interpreted as a type of snail. However, many argue that blue is blue, its source is less important than its symbolism. Over time, the original method of obtaining techelet was lost, and for centuries, tzitzit were worn without the blue thread. In modern times, efforts have been made to restore the practice of including techelet, though its exact origins remain debated. Jesus, Yeshua, affirmed the Torah, including the wearing of tzitzit. In Matthew 23 verse 5, He criticized religious leaders for making their tzitzit overly long to show off their piety. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. This suggests that tzitzit were meant as a personal and humble reminder rather than a show of religious superiority. One of the most well-known stories about Jesus and tzitzit is found in Mark 5 verses 25-34 and Luke 8 verses 43-48, where a woman with an issue of blood touches the hem of His garment and is healed. The word translated as hem Greek, kraspedon, refers to the fringes or tzitzit. This act demonstrates the power associated with obedience to God's commands and faith in His promises. The Bible commands wearing tzitzit, but it does not specify whether they must be fully visible or partially concealed. Many believe they should be worn discreetly, focusing on personal devotion rather than public display. Others argue that they should be seen, as the text says, that you may look upon them. For those who observe this commandment today, tzitzit serve as a daily reminder to walk in righteousness. They encourage mindfulness of God's presence and help believers avoid temptation. While traditionally attached to a four-cornered garment called a tal of katan, some wearers integrate them into modern clothing styles. Tzitzit remain a powerful biblical symbol of faith, obedience, and identity. Whether worn under or over clothing, the purpose of tzitzit remains unchanged, to remind God's people of His commandments and their call to holiness. The Torah specifically commands that a blue, techelet, thread be included in the tzitzit, Numbers 15:38, symbolizing divine authority, the heavenly realm, and spiritual vision. This command is significant in connection to Jesus, Yeshua, as the tzitzit played a direct role in His ministry. In Matthew 9 verses 20-22, also Mark 5 verses 25-34, Luke 8 verses 43-48, a woman suffering from chronic illness reached out and touched the hem of His garment, a phrase that refers to the fringes, tzitzit, on His robe. Immediately, she was healed. This act demonstrates that His tzitzit were not just a sign of obedience to Torah, but also carried the power and authority of God's righteousness. Additionally, Malachi 4 verse 2 prophesies that the Messiah will bring healing in His wings, kanaf in Hebrew, the same word used for the corners where tzitzit are placed. This further solidifies the idea that tzitzit are not merely ritual garments but a visible expression of faith, divine connection, and the power of God working through His chosen ones. Thus, the blue thread is not just a tradition, it is a commandment given by God and a prophetic symbol fulfilled in Jesus, pointing to holiness, healing, and divine authority. Traditional tzitzit are tied in a specific way to symbolize God's unity and commandments. The knots and windings are arranged to spell out Yehovah, God's name, and 613, representing the 613 commandments in the Torah. A common tying method has 5 knots, with 4 spaces between them, which some interpret as representing the Torah, 5 books of Moses. This structure reinforces that wearing tzitzit is not just a physical act but a spiritual discipline. In ancient Israel, the hem, kanaf, of a garment often represented a person's status and authority. This is why, when David cut off a piece of Saul's robe, 1 Samuel 24 verse 4, it was seen as a challenge to Saul's kingship. The woman touching Jesus' tzitzit, Luke 8 verses 43 to 48, wasn't just touching cloth, she was reaching for the authority and righteousness he represented. The Messiah is prophesied to bring healing in his wings, Malachi 4 verse 2, which some interpret as a reference to tzitzit. This shows that tzitzit connect to divine authority and healing. The blue, tachelet, thread represents more than just a color, it is symbolic of heaven and God's throne, Ezekiel 1 verse 26. Priestly garments, Exodus 28 verse 31. Spiritual vision, seeing life from God's perspective. The inclusion of blue in tzitzit reminds where the Torah states that tzitzit should be worn by the children of Israel, Numbers 15:38. The Bible speaks of grafted-in believers, Romans 11 verse 17, and the idea that the Torah is not exclusive to one group, but for all who follow the God of Israel. This raises the question, is wearing tzitzit an identity marker, or a universal call to holiness? The answer depends on individual conviction. For those who follow the commandment, wearing tzitzit can be a reminder to stay faithful to God's instructions in daily life, a discipline that keeps the heart and mind focused on righteousness, a conversation starter that can lead to sharing faith with others. Some people wear tzitzit outside their clothing as a public testimony, while others wear them under their clothes as a private commitment. They remind us of God's commandments, Numbers 15:39. They symbolize divine authority, 1 Samuel 24 verse 4, Luke 8 verses 43 to 48. They connect us to the heavenly realm, tachelet, blue thread. They encourage daily faithfulness and obedience. They can be worn by anyone who chooses to follow God's ways. Whether you wear tzitzit or not, their meaning can inspire everyone to live a life of holiness, obedience, and devotion to God. While the Torah does not specify how tzitzit should be tied, various traditions have emerged over centuries. Uses 7-8-11-13 windings between the knots. The numerical values of these windings correspond to key Jewish words. 7 plus 8 is equal to 15, which represents YH, the first letters of God's name. 11 corresponds to VH, the second part of God's name. 13 represents Akkad, 1, connecting to the Shema prayer, the Lord is one. Historically, the blue thread, tachelet, was derived from a sea creature called the kilazon. The Talmud describes it as appearing from the sea only once in 70 years, producing a blue dye that does not fade. However, after the destruction of the Second Temple, 70 CE, the identity of the kilazon was lost. Because of this, for over 1,000 years, most Jews stopped wearing the blue thread, following rabbinic guidance that it should not be worn if the original dye source was uncertain. In the 19th and 20th centuries, some scholars and rabbis attempted to rediscover tachelet, leading to two major views. Some believe it comes from the Murex trunculus, a Mediterranean sea snail, whose dye turns blue when exposed to sunlight. Others argue that blue is blue, meaning that the source of the dye does not matter as long as the color matches biblical descriptions. Today, many Jews have reintroduced tachelet into their tzitzit, but others still follow the tradition of wearing all-white fringes. Orthodox Jewish men always wear tzitzit, either tucked in or out, from childhood. In Hasidic groups, some men wear a special white garment, talith katan, over their shirts. Many choose to wear tzitzit visibly as a statement of Jewish identity. Some wear tachelet, following recent discoveries about its dye source. Conservative Jews may wear tzitzit, but often only during prayer with a talif. Reform Jews generally do not consider it obligatory, though some choose to wear them as a personal spiritual practice. Karaites wear tzitzit but without knots. They believe tzitzit should be simple, unbraided threads. They also argue that techelet should be any natural blue, not necessarily from a sea creature. Traditionally, tzitzit have been considered a male-specific commandment. However, the Torah does not explicitly forbid women from wearing them. Some Jewish women, particularly in Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox communities, wear tzitzit as an expression of personal devotion. In Hasidic and traditional Orthodox circles, women do not wear them, as it is seen as an obligation only for men. The mitzvah, commandment, applies to all who seek to remember God's laws. Tzitzit are more than just fringes on a garment, they are a direct commandment from God, a symbol of divine authority, and a reminder of righteousness. Their interpretation varies among Jewish traditions, but their purpose remains the same. That you may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy to your God. Numbers 15:40. Thus, the blue thread is not just a tradition, it is a commandment given by God and a prophetic symbol fulfilled in Jesus, pointing to holiness, healing, and divine authority.